Hello, and welcome to Empowered Learning. This particular lesson will be on how to plot points in a Cartesian plane, as well as identifying if a point is in the first, second, third, or fourth quadrant, or if it is not in a quadrant at all, and using an application where we do a seating chart very similar to how a Cartesian plane is, and we locate people by coordinates. So let's go ahead and get started. So we see in front of us that we have a Cartesian plane, and the Cartesian plane is just better known as the XY plane, where we have X coordinates and Y coordinates at. And so the first thing that we want to note is that everything is with respect to the origin. So I'm going to mark where the origin is here on my graph. So right here is our origin, and that's considered to be the point 0, 0. And so when we go to the right, we're going in what we call the positive X direction. So our X values get more positive as we go here. As we go to the left, we are going in the negative X direction. And so that would go this way. Now, horizontally, again, as we go further and further to the right, we're getting more positive with the X values. As we go to the left, we're getting more negative with the X values. If we now look at the y-axis, we know that if we go up on the y-axis here, we're going in the positive y direction. And if we are going down on the y-axis, we are going in the negative y direction. And so knowing that, and assuming that each of the divisions or grids for this particular graph is representing one unit, we can figure out the location of these points by taking how many units we go from the origin in the X direction and how many units we go from that point to the Y direction. So as an example, I'm going to locate point A. So if we look here for point A, we see that it's located right here. And so to get here, we go 1, 2, 3 units in the X direction. So for here, we need to write our coordinate 3, and then we go up 1, 2 units in the Y direction. So this particular point, point A, would be at the point 3, 2. All right, so we have our first point here. If we wanted to know what quadrant it is in, this particular one would be in quadrant 1. And we know that this point is in quadrant 1, denoted by this Roman numeral 1 right here, is because in quadrant 1, we know that both the X coordinates and the Y coordinates are both positive numbers. Okay? So for this particular one, we know that it is in quadrant 1. So now what we're going to do is move on and figure out what the rest of these points are, or where the rest of these points are. Okay? And so let me move up here. So for point B, we see that point B is down here. And in order to get to it, we have to go starting from the origin. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 units in the X direction. And then 1, 2, 3, 4 units in the negative Y direction. So if we do that, that point will be 7, negative 4. And of course, since the X coordinate is positive, the Y coordinate is negative, we know that is going to be located in quadrant 4. Moving on to C, we see that C is right here, just a couple of units below the origin. Now, from our origin right here, we notice that we do not move to the right or to the left any units. So what that tells us is we went 0 units in the X direction. And to get to C now, in the Y direction, we go down 2 units. So that will be minus 2 for Y. Now, when we ask what quadrant this point is in, the answer to it is none. Okay, because here we notice that all of our points for the x and y coordinates, they either have to be positive or negative. Notice here that for the x coordinate, we have 0. 0 is neither positive nor negative. So points that are on the x-axis or points that are on the y-axis are not considered to be in any quadrant. So for here, we would just have to put not applicable. All right, let's move on to D. So for D, we're right here. And in order to get there, we must go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 units in the negative x direction. So we'll go ahead and note that. And then we have to go from this point here, go up 2 in the y direction. That would be positive 2. And so from there, we know that this particular point is in quadrant 2. I'll go ahead and make that a little bit more clear. For point E is here. And we see that point E is in quadrant 3. In quadrant 3, both our x and y coordinates are negative. So therefore, we will go ahead and note now that E is in quadrant 3. And so to get there from the origin, we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 units in the negative x direction, and then 1, 2, 3 units in the negative y direction. So for this one, we have -5, -3 as our coordinate. Now, one thing I do want to reiterate here is that we are writing the coordinates with parentheses versus writing it this way. And so the reason for that is when we write it with parentheses like this, we are implying that order matters, meaning that this is the set of points that we have here on this particular plane is a permutation. When we write it this way in set notation, we're saying that it is a combination where order does not matter. So that's one of the reasons why when we do coordinates, we do them with parentheses versus set notation. Okay, so now we're going to go ahead and move on to point F. So we see that point F is here on the x-axis. And we notice to get there from the origin, we have to go 1, 2, 3 units in the negative x direction. And then we do not go up or down since we're already there, so that's 0 units in the y direction. And so for here, this would be an A for the quadrant because it is on the x-axis. Lastly, we look at point G, and we see that point G is way up here. And so we go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 units in the x direction. So I'll just come here, 8 units in the x direction, then positive x direction, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 units in the positive y direction. So for G here, we'll see that our point is located at 8, 8, and this particular point is in quadrant 1. All right, so now what we want to do is switch gears for a second. And instead of looking at a Cartesian plane with points on there and us locating the actual or listing the coordinates for the points, this time we're given what the point is, and we want to be able to identify which quadrant it is without having the visual there for us. So what we want to remember here is the following. So we know that for quadrant 1, we know that we have to have both x and y coordinates be positive. For quadrant 2, x is negative, y is positive. For quadrant 3, we know that x and y are both negative. And for quadrant 4, we know that x is positive and y is negative. So if you can just remember that, then figuring out where these points go are pretty easy. So the last thing that we want to take note of is that if we have a point that is either on the x or y axis here, then our point is not considered to be in any quadrant. So if we look at our first point, we have 3, 0, which is about right here. And we know that that's on the x-axis. So we would say NA, or not applicable, because it is not on any axis. Sorry, it is not on in any quadrant, excuse me. So our next point, negative 4, 5. So we see that x is negative and y is positive. So x is negative, y is positive. This has to be in quadrant number 2. And so remember that when we name our quadrants, we name them in a counterclockwise fashion. Okay. The point negative 1, negative 1 matches negative, negative. So this would be quadrant 3. The point 0, negative 10 is down here on the y-axis, and since it is on an axis, we know that it is not in any quadrant. The point 100, negative 52, has positive x value, negative y value. So that would be in quadrant 4. The point 2216, both x and y are positive, so that would be quadrant 1. And the point 0, 0, of course, that's our origin, and that would be not applicable because it's not in any quadrant. Okay, so now we are at our final example where we have taken our Cartesian plane and rearranged it in a way to where now we are talking about a seating chart for a particular room. And so just to give us an example of how to read this particular chart, we see that we have Daisy here, and Daisy is located at position 2, I guess you can say column 2, row 3. So you can sort of think of it that way. But my point here is that when we do this, we want to make sure that we know that the 1, 2, and 3 that are here we're reading as x values, and the 1, 2, 3, 4 that we're reading here is as y values. So of course, Daisy is right here, and we see that we go 2 units in the positive x direction, 3 units in the positive y direction, and we see that's where she's located at. So now from that, we want to go ahead and locate everyone else. So we see Marvin is way in the back here, so we have to go 1, 2, 3 units over, and then 1, 2, 3, 4 up. So Marvin's position would be at 3, 4. Chris, still in the same row as Marvin here, but instead of going 4 seats back, we're only 2 seats back. So that would be 3, 2. Don is over here in row 1. And so we go 1 unit over, or 1 row here, and then down 2 rows there, and we have Don at position 1, 2. And then Elsie is our last person. We see that Elsie is in a position to where she's in this row 2 here, first person. So this is how we could augment a Cartesian plane or XY plane to be able to do a seating chart. This concludes our lesson on plotting points using a Cartesian